The old truck groaned up the final incline, its engine a ragged cough against the sharp stillness of the mountain air. Elias Thorne kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the heavy head of the German shepherd in the passenger seat. The dog, Boulder, did not stir, his amber eyes fixed on the winding dirt road ahead as if he were the one navigating. They had been driving for 3 days, leaving a life of concrete and ghosts behind them for this, a promise of solitude etched into a topographical map. Elias killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, a physical weight that pressed in on the cab of the truck. Below them, the small town of Silver Creek was a scattering of rooftops and a single winking traffic light. Above them, the mountain clawed at a sky the color of faded denim. This was it, the end of the line. He slid out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel pull-off. The cold was a clean, sharp shock to his system. It smelled of pine and damp earth and something ancient, something that had been here long before people and would remain long after. He breathed it in, a long, slow pull that seemed to scour the dust of the past from his lungs. For a moment, his chest felt less heavy. Boulder hopped down, his paws silent on the ground. He moved to Elias's side, a solid, warm presence. The dog looked down at the town, then back up at the dense forest that began just feet from the road. A low whine whispered from his throat. "I know, boy," Elias murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "It's a long way from anywhere." That was the point. He had purchased the land sight unseen, a 40-acre parcel of unforgiving verticality with a single, crucial feature noted on the deed. A geological anomaly. A cave. His plan was simple, if insane. He was not just going to live on the mountain. He was going to live in it. He was going to build a fortress against the world, against the memories, against the cold that had nothing to do with weather. The first few weeks were a blur of methodical labor. He and Boulder made their camp near the mouth of the cave, a dark slash in a granite cliff face. The air that breathed from its depths was colder still, carrying the scent of stone and perpetual night. Elias spent days just exploring its initial chambers, mapping the twists and turns with a headlamp and a spool of twine. It was perfect, deeper than the survey had suggested, stable and utterly isolated. His trips into Silver Creek were surgical strikes. He would drive down in the rattling truck, a list clutched in his hand, and move through the town's single hardware store and small grocery with grim efficiency. He bought things that made no sense to the people who watched him. Not just lumber and nails, but spools of industrial-grade steel cable, heavy-duty winches, bags of specialized concrete mix, and strange plumbing components that looked like they belonged in a factory. The man behind the counter at the hardware store, a burly fellow with a perpetually skeptical squint named Garrett, would eye his purchases with unconcealed curiosity. "Building a bunker, are we?" Garrett had asked one afternoon, his voice laced with the easy mockery of a man who knew everyone and everything in his town. Elias had just looked at him, his expression flat. He didn't offer a smile or an explanation. He paid in cash, loaded his truck with the quiet, intense focus of a man defusing a bomb, and drove away. The silence he left behind was more damning than any angry retort. He could feel their eyes on him. The whispers followed the rumble of his truck up the mountain road. He was the strange man, the outsider, the veteran with the haunted eyes and the big, silent dog who never left his side. They saw him hauling steel beams up the treacherous path with a block and tackle system, a feat of engineering and brute force that seemed both pointless and alarming. Sarah, the young woman who worked the register at the grocery store, was kinder. She had soft, worried eyes and always made a point to comment on Boulder, who would wait patiently in the truck, his head framed in the open window. "He's a beautiful dog," she'd say, her voice gentle. "He's a good boy," Elias would reply, the words clipped and final. It was the most he ever offered. He bought canned goods by the case, flour and salt in 50-pound bags, and enough medical supplies to stock a small clinic. His cart looked like he was preparing for the end of the world. In a way, he was. He was preparing for the end of his world, the one that kept trying to claw its way back into his head. Back on the mountain, the work was his salvation. The physical exertion quieted the noise. He designed it all in a thick, leather-bound notebook, his sketches precise and detailed. He wasn't just building a cabin inside a cave. He was integrating it, reinforcing the entrance with steel and concrete to create an impenetrable archway. Inside, he framed out a small, efficient living space, a single room with a sleeping area, a kitchen, and a workshop. The real work, the part that would have seemed truly mad to the people in the valley, was the systems. He ran insulated PEX tubing deep into the rock, a rudimentary geothermal loop that would use the Earth's constant temperature to help heat the space. He installed a small, military-grade diesel generator in a ventilated side chamber, soundproofed with layers of insulation. He built a complex water filtration system that drew from a seep deep within the cave. Boulder was his constant shadow, his foreman, his only confidant. The dog would lie on a patch of sun-warmed granite, watching Elias wrestle with a steel beam or meticulously solder a pipe joint. When Elias grew frustrated, muttering curses under his breath, Boulder would get up, walk over, and nudge his hand with a wet nose. The simple, grounding touch was often enough to pull him back from the edge. "You think this is crazy, don't you?" Elias asked the dog one evening, staring at the half-finished frame of his cave home. The shadows were growing long, painting the forest in shades of deep purple and black. Boulder rested his heavy head on Elias's knee and sighed, a warm puff of air in the cooling twilight. The message was clear. If you're doing it, it isn't crazy. The gossip in Silver Creek grew with the changing seasons. As summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn, Elias's project became a local legend. He was the hermit on the mountain, the crazy vet. Garrett, holding court at the town's only diner, would spin tales for the loggers and ranchers. "Saw him hauling a wood stove up there last week, a big one. Thing must weigh 500 pounds. Used that crazy pulley system of his. Took him all day." Garrett would shake his head, a smirk on his face. "Whatever he's hiding from, it must be something fierce." The laughter that followed was uneasy. They didn't understand him, and that lack of understanding curdled into suspicion. He was a loose variable in their predictable world. One afternoon, the predictable world came to him. A county sheriff's vehicle, clean and official, made its way carefully up his rugged road. Elias saw it from his perch on the scaffolding, the glint of the sun off the windshield a hostile star in the green canopy. He felt his jaw clench. Boulder, napping below, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," Elias said, his voice a low command. He climbed down, his movements deliberate, betraying none of the sudden tension that coiled in his gut. Sheriff Brody was a tall man, his uniform crisp, his face weathered by years of dealing with the mundane and the tragic. He didn't have Garrett's mocking tone, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. He took in the scene, the reinforced cave mouth, the stacks of materials, the lone figure of Elias standing with his formidable dog. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice even. "Just doing a wellness check. Folks in town said they hadn't seen you in a while." "I've been busy," Elias replied. His hands felt heavy at his sides. He resisted the urge to cross his arms, a defensive posture he'd been trained to recognize and avoid. "So I see." Sheriff Brody's gaze swept over the construction. "Mind telling me what exactly it is you're building up here, Mr. Thorne?" The question was polite, but it was not a request. It was an order wrapped in courtesy. "A home?" Elias said. "That's a lot of steel for a home," Brody observed, gesturing with his chin toward the massive I-beam that formed the new lintel of the cave entrance. "And I got a call from the FAA. A pilot reported a strange antenna array on this mountain. Looks a lot like a long-range radio setup." Elias didn't flinch. "I like to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" The sheriff's voice was still calm, but an edge of steel had crept into it. "Some of the folks in town are getting imaginative. They're worried. You're a veteran, right? They see the supplies, the isolation. They start thinking things." The unspoken words hung in the cold air. Separatist, domestic terrorist, unstable. A muscle in Elias's cheek twitched. The only thing they need to worry about is their own business. The sheriff held his gaze for a long moment. Boulder, sensing the shift in tension, took a half step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elias. The dog's stance was not aggressive, but it was an unmistakable statement of loyalty and protection. Brody's eyes flickered to the dog, then back to Elias. He gave a slow nod. "All right, Thorne, for now. But this isn't the Wild West. You're part of this county. Try to remember that." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, leaving Elias standing in the dust and the sudden ringing silence. The encounter had pierced the bubble of his solitude, a sharp reminder that he could never truly be separate. The world always found a way to intrude. That night, the ghosts came for him. He was lying on his cot inside the partially finished structure, the scent of fresh-cut pine sharp in the cold air. Boulder was asleep at his feet, a heavy, reassuring weight. But the sheriff's questions had unlocked a door in his mind, a door he fought every day to keep bolted shut. The cold was the trigger. Not the clean cold of the mountain, but a different kind, a damp, suffocating cold that smelled of diesel fumes and fear. He was back there, the Hindu Kush. The patrol was moving through a high mountain pass, the snow squeaking under their boots. The silence was absolute, the kind that made the ringing in your ears feel like a scream. He remembered looking up at the cornice of snow hanging over the valley, a vast white wave frozen in time. It looked unstable. He'd said as much to his lieutenant. "Looks heavy, sir." The lieutenant had waved him off. "It's been there 1,000 years, Thorne. It'll be there 1,000 more." Then came the sound. Not a roar, not at first. Just a sharp crack, like the universe splitting open. It was followed by a deep, guttural groan from the mountain itself. The stillness shattered. The white wave wasn't frozen anymore. It was moving. He was running, but it was like running in a dream. The air thickened, turning white and solid. The roar was deafening, a physical force that picked him up and threw him. Then came the pressure, the heavy, crushing weight, and the cold, the suffocating cold that stole his breath and filled his mouth with snow. He was buried, trapped in a tomb of ice and silence. The weight on his chest was unbearable. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. There was only the darkness, the pressure, and the numbing, final cold. Elias sat bolt upright on his cot, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, but he could feel the walls of snow closing in. The heavy weight was on his chest, crushing him. He clawed at his throat, a ragged, desperate sound tearing from his lungs. He couldn't breathe. A wet nose shoved hard against his cheek. A heavy weight settled not on his chest, but in his lap. Two paws planted themselves firmly on his shoulders. Boulder whined, a high, anxious sound, and started licking his face, frantic, wet swipes across his forehead, his cheeks, his neck. The physical sensation was a shock, a sudden grounding anchor in the swirling chaos of the memory. The rough tongue, the warm breath, the solid, living weight of the dog. Elias wrapped his arms around Boulder's thick neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. He dragged in a shuddering breath that smelled of dog and pine, not snow and death. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or to himself. "It's okay, boy. I'm here. I'm here." He held on, his knuckles white, until the hammering in his chest slowed to a heavy, rhythmic beat. The phantom weight receded. The walls of the cave home solidified around him, wood and rock, not ice. He was on his mountain, not in that frozen grave. Boulder had pulled him out. Again. Autumn deepened, the aspens turning from green to brilliant, trembling gold. Elias worked with a renewed, almost frantic urgency. The flashback had been a warning. Winter was coming. He needed to be ready. He finished the interior walls, installed the thick, insulated windows that looked out from the cave mouth, and got the wood stove operational. The first time he lit it, the warmth that filled the small space felt like a victory. The signs of the coming crisis were subtle at first, whispers on the wind. The squirrels, usually bold and chattering, vanished. The deer moved down from the high country weeks earlier than usual. Elias, his senses honed by a different kind of war, noticed everything. He watched the sky. The clouds were different, gathering in strange, bruised-looking formations in the west. Boulder felt it too. The dog grew restless, pacing the length of the cave entrance. He would stand with his nose to the wind, a low, continuous whine in his throat. He refused to wander far on their walks, staying close to the safety of their stone fortress. "You feel it coming, don't you, boy?" Elias said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Something big." One afternoon, on his last planned supply run before holing up for the winter, he stood in Garrett's hardware store. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and metal and the murmur of conversation. Elias was buying a final set of heavy-duty batteries and a spare filter for his water system. Garrett rang him up, his usual smirk firmly in place. "Stocking up for the apocalypse, Thorne?" Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the storefront window. The sky had a strange, yellowish tint. Elias looked from the window to Garrett's smug face. He wasn't a man who liked to give warnings. He wasn't a man who liked to engage. But his training, the part of him that was hardwired to assess threats and protect, took over. "A storm is coming," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A bad one." "Worse than you think." Garrett laughed, a short, barking sound. "Oh, the Hermit of the Mountain is a weatherman now, is he? We get snow every year, Thorne. It's called winter." "This is different," Elias insisted, a flicker of something sharp in his eyes. "The pressure is dropping too fast. The animals are gone. You should tell people to prepare. Board up windows on the west side of their houses. Have enough supplies for a week, maybe more. Stay off the roads." The other men in the store had stopped their conversations to listen. They looked from Elias's intense, serious face to Garrett's mocking one. They chose the familiar comfort of mockery. "You hear that, boys?" Garrett called out. "The crazy man on the mountain says we're all doomed. Better run for the hills. Oh, wait." He paused for dramatic effect. "He's already in the hills." The store filled with laughter. It wasn't just humor. It was a release of their collective unease. By laughing at Elias, they could dismiss the strange feeling the yellow sky and the moaning wind gave them. They could dismiss the part of them that felt a primal flicker of fear. Elias's face became a mask of stone. He had done his duty. He had given the warning. It was ignored. He picked up his bags, turned without another word, and walked out of the store. The laughter followed him to his truck. He didn't look back. As he drove up the mountain, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, fluffy flakes of a picturesque winter. They were small, hard, and sharp, like pellets of ice driven by a wind that screamed through the pines. By the time he reached his cave, the world had disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The wind howled, a living entity that threw itself against the granite face of the mountain. Inside his shelter, it was a different world. The wood stove radiated a steady, comforting warmth. The insulated walls deadened the storm's roar to a distant, muffled rage. A single electric bulb, powered by the generator humming softly in its soundproofed chamber, cast a calm, yellow glow over the room. Elias stripped off his snow-caked outerwear and hung it on a peg. Boulder, who had been waiting anxiously, nudged his hand and licked away the ice crystals clinging to his beard. Elias sank onto a simple wooden chair, the exhaustion of the day settling deep into his bones. He had done everything he could. He had built his ark. Now the flood was here. He turned on his long-range radio, the one the sheriff had been so suspicious of. He tuned it to the local emergency frequency. For the first hour, it was just the dispatcher's calm voice reporting road closures. Then, the tone began to change. The calls became more frequent, more urgent. Reports of a roof collapsed at the old Miller farm. Power lines down on Route 4. The whole east side of the valley is dark. Plows are being called back. The drifts are too high. Visibility is 0. Elias listened, a grim satisfaction warring with a sense of dread in his chest. This was his vindication. The moment his strange, obsessive preparations were proven not to be madness, but foresight. He was safe. He was warm. He and Boulder had everything they needed. Outside, the world he had tried so hard to keep at a distance was being torn apart. The snow fell for 2 days without stopping. It was a relentless, vertical siege. The wind never ceased its assault. Elias's world shrank to the confines of his shelter. He checked his systems, monitored the radio, and sat for long hours with Boulder, listening to the muffled fury outside. The radio reports grew more desperate. The town was cut off. The state police couldn't get through. People were trapped in their homes, many without power or heat. Then came the call that changed everything. It wasn't over the official radio. It was a faint, breaking signal on a civilian channel he had been scanning. A woman's voice, thin and terrified. "Anyone hear me? This is Sarah at the general store. We have a generator, but Garrett's family. He went to check his roof and the whole back end of the house. It's on the west slope. There was a slide, a small one, but—" Her voice broke into a sob. "Please, is anyone out there? They're trapped. I can't reach the sheriff. I think their house is buried." Elias's blood ran cold. Garrett. The man who had laughed in his face. His family. He looked at the warmth of his stove, at the solid safety of his rock walls. He could stay here. No one would know he had even heard the call. It was not his problem. He had built this sanctuary to escape the world, not to save it. He looked down at Boulder. The dog was staring at the radio, his ears perked, his body tense. He looked from the radio to Elias and let out a soft whine. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of expectation, of duty. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an activation. The part of him that was a soldier, a protector, a man who ran toward the sound of chaos, not away from it, took over. The same instinct that had made him build this fortress now commanded him to leave it. "All right, boy," Elias said, his voice a low growl of resolve. "Let's go to work." The transition was brutal. He moved with practiced, efficient speed, pulling on layers of thermal gear, his heavy-duty winter fatigues, and a thick, insulated parka. He strapped a powerful headlamp to his forehead, checked the batteries in his GPS and a handheld radio, and packed a small, rugged backpack with emergency supplies, a medical kit, high-energy food bars, a thermal blanket, and a small, collapsible shovel. Opening the heavy, insulated door was like opening an airlock into a hostile planet. The wind ripped at him, trying to force its way into his sanctuary. A wall of snow drifted halfway up the door, tumbled inside. The roar of the storm was immense, a physical blow that staggered him. He strapped a pair of wide, modern snowshoes to his boots and a matching set custom-made to Boulder's paws. The dog stood patiently, a seasoned veteran of their mountain expeditions. Elias clipped a lead to Boulder's harness, a harness fitted with its own small pack carrying canine first aid supplies. "Stay close," Elias commanded, his voice nearly snatched away by the wind. "You're my eyes and ears out there." They stepped out into the maelstrom. It was not a world of white, but a disorienting, churning gray. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The snow was waist-deep, a heavy, wet powder that made every step a monumental effort. The cold was a physical predator, sharp and biting, seeking any sliver of exposed skin. Garrett's house was on the other side of a low ridge, less than 2 miles away as the crow flies. In these conditions, it might as well have been on the moon. Elias relied on his GPS, but more than that, he relied on his own internal compass and on Boulder. The dog forged ahead, his powerful body plowing a path through the drifts, his head low, his nose constantly testing the air. The forest was a landscape of ghosts. Trees, heavy with snow, loomed out of the gray void like skeletal giants. The only sounds were the howl of the wind and the strained, rhythmic gasps of Elias's own breathing. The shadows played tricks on his eyes, twisting into familiar, threatening shapes from a past he could not outrun. He saw figures in the swirling snow, men from his unit, their faces pale and frost-rimmed. He shook his head, forcing them away. He had a new mission now. They had to cross a small, open meadow. Here, the wind was a solid wall of force. It knocked Elias to his knees, the breath driven from his lungs. The cold was savage. He could feel it seeping through his layers, a deep, numbing chill that went straight to the bone. For a terrifying moment, the memory of the avalanche threatened to overwhelm him, the pressure, the suffocating white darkness. Boulder was there. The dog turned back, barking, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the wind's roar. He pushed his body against Elias's, licking at the ice forming on his goggles, grounding him in the here and now. Elias gritted his teeth, pushed himself back to his feet, and leaned into the wind, one agonizing step at a time. It took them nearly 2 hours to cover the distance. They found the house not by sight, but by smell. Boulder stopped, his nose high, and let out a series of sharp barks. Elias peered into the gloom and saw it, or what was left of it. A small avalanche, a river of snow and debris from the overloaded slope above, had slammed into the back of the house. The entire rear portion was gone, buried under a mountain of white. The front of the house stood intact, but dark, the windows like vacant eyes. "Garrett!" Elias bellowed, his voice raw. "Can you hear me?" Only the wind answered. He unclipped Boulder's lead. "Find them, boy," he commanded. "Find them!" The dog sprang into action. He scrambled over the massive drift, his nose to the snow, sniffing, digging, whining. Elias followed, his own shovel in hand. His training took over. He assessed the debris field, looking for void spaces, for any sign of where the occupants might be. The main slide had hit the kitchen and living room. People would have been there. Boulder started digging frantically at one spot, barking insistently. Elias joined him, his shovel biting into the hard-packed snow. It was like digging through concrete. Sweat froze on his forehead despite the bitter cold. His muscles screamed in protest. Every scoop was heavy, a dead weight that fought him. After 10 minutes of furious digging, his shovel struck something, not wood, fabric. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the snow with his gloved hands. He uncovered the sleeve of a child's pink snowsuit. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through him. He dug faster, with a desperate, focused energy. He uncovered a small, still form, a little girl no older than 6, unconscious. He checked for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready. He worked his hands under her, lifting her carefully. She was terrifyingly light. As he straightened up, a section of the ruined roof above them, overloaded with snow, gave a loud, groaning crack. Elias looked up just in time to see a huge mass of snow and splintered wood begin to slide. It was no time to move. He instinctively curled his body around the child, bracing for the impact. But before it hit, a black and tan blur shot past him. Boulder, with a ferocious bark, leaped and slammed his body into Garrett's wife, who had just emerged from a pocket of debris behind Elias, shoving her clear. The falling mass of wood and ice crashed down where she had been standing, catching Boulder with a glancing, brutal blow. The dog let out a sharp cry of pain, a sound that cut Elias to the core. The mass of debris pinned the dog's hind leg. Garrett's wife, dazed but alive, scrambled back, her face a mask of terror. At the same moment, Garrett himself crawled out from under a collapsed section of porch, his face bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "My daughter!" he screamed, seeing the small form in Elias's arms. "She's alive," Elias grunted, his focus split between the child, the new arrivals, and his injured dog. "We have to get out of here. The whole structure is unstable." He could see Boulder struggling, whining, trying to free his trapped leg. The sight sent a wave of cold fury through Elias. He handed the child to her mother. "Hold her. Keep her warm." He turned back to the debris pile. It was a tangle of broken rafters and packed snow. He grabbed a long, splintered 2x4 and jammed it under the main beam, pinning Boulder's leg, using a chunk of ice-coated rubble as a fulcrum. "Garrett!" he yelled over the wind. "On this! Now! Push!" Garrett, his face pale with shock, stared for a second, then seemed to understand. He threw his weight onto the makeshift lever with Elias. The beam groaned, resisting. "Again!" Elias roared. They pushed, their muscles straining, their breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. The heavy beam lifted, just an inch, then two. It was enough. Boulder scrambled free, dragging his injured leg behind him. He whimpered, a low, pathetic sound that was worse than any scream. Elias didn't hesitate. He scooped the huge dog into his arms. Boulder weighed nearly 100 pounds, a dead, heavy weight. The effort was immense. "My wife, her ankle," Garrett stammered, pointing to his wife, who was now leaning heavily against him. "We all have to move," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. He looked at the family, then at the dog in his arms. He had one backpack of supplies. His own strength was finite. The journey back would be twice as hard. "My shelter is 2 miles from here, straight over that ridge," Elias said, nodding his head into the white chaos. "It's our only chance. I'll carry the dog. You help your wife. Your daughter needs to be carried. We trade off, understand?" Garrett, the man who had mocked him, who had laughed at his preparations, just stared at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning, horrified respect. He nodded, his expression numb. The return journey was a vision of hell. The storm had not lessened its fury. Elias, carrying the heavy weight of Boulder, led the way. The dog was quiet in his arms, his breathing shallow. Elias could feel the wet warmth of blood seeping through his parka from the dog's leg. The thought of it fueled a cold, burning rage that kept him moving, that kept the encroaching exhaustion at bay. He had to leave equipment behind. He shrugged off his own backpack, the one with his spare supplies, and handed it to Garrett. "Food and a blanket in there. Use it for the girl." The choice was instant, automatic. The dog's life was not negotiable. It was a heavier weight than any pack. They moved as a single, struggling unit. Garrett, half carrying his wife, stumbled behind. Elias would break the trail for 50 yards, then set Boulder down gently, go back and take the small, still unconscious girl from Garrett, carrying her for a stretch while Garrett focused on his wife. Then they would switch again. It was a slow, brutal, and agonizing rhythm. Every step was a battle. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence. The wind tore at them, stealing their warmth and their will. Elias's body screamed. His back, his legs, his arms, all of it was on fire. But he kept going. He focused on the next step, and the next. He whispered to Boulder, whose head rested against his chest. "Hang on, boy. We're almost there. Just hang on." When the reinforced entrance to his cave finally loomed out of the swirling snow, it looked like the gateway to heaven. Elias fumbled with the door, his fingers numb and clumsy. He pushed it open, and the four of them, plus the dog, stumbled into the calm, quiet warmth of the shelter. The sudden peace was disorienting. The silence, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the hum of the generator, felt absolute after the storm's unending roar. Elias gently laid Boulder on a thick wool blanket near the fire. He stripped off his gloves and immediately went to work on the dog's leg. It was a deep, ugly gash, but the bone seemed intact. He cleaned it with antiseptic from his well-stocked medical kit, applied a clotting agent, and wrapped it tightly. Only then did he turn to the family. They were huddled together, staring around the room with wide, disbelieving eyes. They looked at the neat stacks of supplies, the humming water filter, the glowing electric light, the pervading warmth. They were looking at the physical manifestation of the madness they had mocked, and it had just saved their lives. Elias checked on the little girl, whose name he learned was Lily. She was stirring, her color returning in the warmth. He examined Garrett's wife's ankle, a bad sprain but not broken. He gave them food and hot, sweet tea. He worked with a detached, professional calm, the medic part of his training taking over. Garrett watched him, his face a mess of emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick and hoarse. "Thorn, He couldn't seem to find the words. He just shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I am so sorry. We would be dead. My family, we would be dead." Elias looked at the man, then at the sleeping child, then at his dog, who was now resting, his tail giving a weak, thumping beat on the floor. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction in being right, just a deep, profound weariness. "Just get some rest," he said, his voice softer than Garrett had ever heard it. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. The silence that descended in its wake was profound. The next morning, the sun rose on a world transformed, buried under a dozen feet of pristine, deadly snow. From the mouth of his cave, Elias could see the devastation in the valley. It was a landscape of white humps and broken trees. Later that day, a new sound reached them, the distant, rhythmic whomp, whomp, whomp of a helicopter. A search and rescue team, finally able to fly. Elias used his radio to guide them in, giving them the coordinates to a small, flat clearing a quarter-mile from his cave. When the community, or what was left of its leadership, Sheriff Brody, a shaken-looking mayor, and a few others, gathered near the landed helicopter, the scene was surreal.
Garrett, his family safe beside him, stood before Elias. The entire group was silent, their faces humbled and raw. Garrett stepped forward. He was no longer the smug town crier. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by the person he had ridiculed. "We came to thank you," Garrett said, his voice clear and steady in the cold, still air. "But that's not the right word. It's not enough. You tried to warn us. We laughed. We called you crazy. And then you and your dog, you walked into hell for us, for my family." He took a shuddering breath. "You saved us, and we're sorry for everything." One by one, others stepped forward. The mayor, a rancher whose barn had collapsed. Even Sheriff Brody, his professional demeanor softened by awe and respect. "We misjudged you, Thorne, badly. We owe you more than we can say." Little Lily, clutching her mother's hand, walked timidly toward Boulder, who was lying on a blanket Elias had brought out. She knelt and gently stroked his head. "Thank you, doggy," she whispered. Boulder licked her hand. It was Sheriff Brody who finally asked the question that hung in the air. He looked from the rescued family to the incredible shelter built into the mountain. "Thorne, Elias, why? Why all this? What did you know that we didn't?" Elias looked at the faces staring at him, no longer with suspicion, but with a desperate need to understand. And for the first time, he felt no need for a wall of silence. The heavy weight in his chest seemed to loosen just a fraction. He told them. He told them about Afghanistan. He told them about the high mountain pass, the unstable cornice of snow, the sudden, sharp crack that split the world. He told them about being buried alive, about the crushing weight, the suffocating cold, the absolute certainty of death in the silent, frozen darkness. "When I got out," he said, his voice low and steady, "I couldn't handle walls anymore, or cities, or the noise. But I couldn't escape the memory of the cold, of the weight." He gestured back toward his cave. "So I came here. I decided to build a place that the mountain couldn't take from me, a place that was stronger than the snow, a place where the cold couldn't reach. I wasn't preparing for a storm. I was trying to build a fortress against a memory." He looked down at Boulder, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. "I thought I was just running, hiding. But I guess I was preparing. I just didn't know who I was preparing for." The silence that followed was one of profound, heartbreaking understanding. They finally saw him, not the crazy vet, not the hermit. They saw a man who had taken his deepest trauma and forged it into a shield he had then used to protect them. In the weeks that followed, the town of Silver Creek began the slow, arduous process of digging out and rebuilding. But something had changed. The dynamic had shifted. They were no longer a town of insiders and one outsider. They were a community of survivors. The mayor and Sheriff Brody came to him again, this time with a formal request. "We have to rebuild," the mayor said. "But we need to rebuild smarter. We were ignorant, complacent. We need you to teach us, Elias. Show us how to be prepared. Show us how to respect this mountain we live on." Elias, who had spent years trying to disconnect from humanity, was now being asked to lead it. He looked at Boulder, whose leg was healing well, and then down at the valley.
He saw not a threat, but a responsibility. He saw a new mission. He agreed. The final months of winter were spent not in isolation, but in collaboration. Elias, the former hermit, became a teacher. He held workshops in the town hall, his voice, once clipped and terse, now patient and clear. He used his detailed notebooks to explain principles of structural integrity, snow load, and emergency preparedness. He taught them how to create defensible space against avalanches, how to store supplies, how to read the weather not from an app, but from the sky and the wind and the behavior of the animals. The people of Silver Creek, led by a deeply humbled and dedicated Garrett, listened. They worked together, reinforcing homes, clearing debris, and setting up a new town-wide emergency communication system based on Elias's long-range radio. They worked with a shared purpose, a quiet determination forged in the heart of the great storm. One evening in early spring, as the last of the snow melted away to reveal the green shoots of new life, Elias stood at the mouth of his cave. The air was soft and cool, filled with the scent of wet earth and budding leaves. Boulder sat beside him, his injured leg now bearing his full weight, leaving only a slight limp. Below, the lights of Silver Creek twinkled on, a constellation of hope in the valley floor. They were no longer the prying eyes of a suspicious town. They were the lights of home, his home. He rested his hand on Boulder's head, the familiar, solid weight a comforting anchor. The stillness of the mountain was no longer threatening. The shadows stretching across the valley were just shadows, not ghosts. The heavy feeling in his chest was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace he had not felt in a decade. He was no longer running from the past. He was building a future, right here, on the mountain that had almost taken everything, and had ultimately given it all back.